Hey everybody, Jeremy Lord here, and we are live. Thanks for joining us today on this three-part stream of absolute Photoshop basics. So this is for like absolute beginners. If you're opening Photoshop for the first time, you're trying to get into digital art and you want to get into it, this stream has got you covered. We're going to talk about opening new files. We're going to talk about creating brushes, coloring, all the Photoshop basics that you'll need for that. So yeah, this will be pretty chill, pretty easy. Pop some questions in the chat. Always happy to interrupt and stop what I'm doing to answer some questions, have a discussion. Doesn't even have to be about Photoshop or digital art. Ask me questions about video games, movies, pop culture, whatever. Always happy to walk and talk, as we say. So what we're going to do today is we're going to get into the very fundamentals of Photoshop. So this is assuming that you're more or less opening Photoshop up for the first time and you're kind of inundated with all of these windows and panels. You don't know where to go and what to kind of start with. So this is what we're going to be doing kind of today. The first thing is you need to kind of think about Photoshop as opposed to something like Adobe Illustrator, which is a vector. It's a little bit. What you need to think about is you are dealing with pixels. So whenever you create a new document, we're going to do that in a sec, you need to think about what the final kind of goal is going to be, right? So are you doing this for an A3 poster? Are you doing this for whatever? You're going to have to create it at that size because it will not rescale as opposed to vector, which can infinitely scale. So let's go ahead and make a new document. So we're going to go up to this file here, new. Now, first thing I want to talk about is you might kind of see these little inputs on the side of all these menus here, right? And what these are shortcuts. Now, shortcuts are absolutely key in basically any program out of the Creative Cloud suite, any app really that you will encounter, be it Adobe or otherwise, will have a bunch of shortcuts. And shortcuts, just as the name suggests, they're shortcuts to streamlining your workflow. They're going to be crucial. You'll often see me kind of doing these streams, not going to these panels. Some of them I've forgotten where they are because we're always using shortcuts. So try and remember these shortcuts. We're going to go through a few. There's a ton of shortcuts in Photoshop. You don't need to know them all for different things. Photography is a completely different Photoshop to what we're doing today, so you don't need to know all of Photoshop. But let's go ahead and create a new document. So here we've got Command or Control if you're on a PC, Command N, and it's going to bring up this document window. So we've got a new document. We've got a bunch of options in here. We can do some photo, we could do print, art and illustration, web, mobile, film, video. We're just going to go with a print, and we're going to go with A4. As I said, if you're thinking of doing this for a poster, if you want to go bigger than A4, then make sure that you check that out and make sure that you're going into all your sizes in here. There's a few. If you know your sizes, you can obviously input that. So we're going to go with A3 potentially. So we're going to go 297 wide by 420 tall, and we are in millimeters, so there's a bunch of options in here as well that you can kind of tick. We got pixels if you're working with digital like web or even pixel art. Inches, nobody uses inches. We're not barbarians, so we're going to stick to centimeters and millimeters. Generally we're looking at millimeters, so we're going to go 297 420 millimeters. That's all good. Don't worry too much about the color modes here, RGB, grayscale. I usually like to work in RGB. If you're working with print, generally speaking, you probably want to go CMYK, but let's stick with RGB for now, and we don't need to worry too much about the rest of this stuff. So we've got an orientation, the size, millimeters, 300 DPI is standard print, so we can now go ahead and hit create. So that's just a bit of kind of before you get started kind of thing. So, the last thing you want to do is make this really awesome illustration and get into kind of really the details, and then you want to print it, and then you created it at a too small a size and you won't be able to upscale it. That's always a little bit of a pain. So have the kind of the forethinking to make it at the size that you want. So we've got a canvas. We're in Photoshop. I've got a bunch of windows open. So let's start a look at that. Let's say kind of what we're looking at. There's a lot of windows in Photoshop that we can kind of mess around with. As you see, a lot of these we don't really need. As you can see, like I've got a bunch of stuff open here. And I'm going to take you guys through what it is that each one does and probably why you need it. Most of these other ones you don't really need. In fact, to be completely honest, if I'm just drawing normally, 90% of the time, I'll literally just have this one, the layers, and my brushes. That's it. That's all I'll have. But let's take a look at a few different kind of options that we can mess around with. So the first one is, as I said, our brushes and our brush settings. So this controls everything that you're going to be creating with. Obviously, we're going to be drawing here, so brushes are going to be super important and an integral part to creating your artwork. So all the settings that you can mess around with in terms of brushes. We'll take a look at that in next week's stream. We're going to look at brush settings in a lot more depth than we are today. The first thing I'm going to say, and the only thing I'm really going to kind of touch upon today with these brushes, is you can create your own, you can download some, you can mess around with the settings, but you will absolutely, if you're thinking about getting into digital illustration, you will need some kind of drawing tablet. And I'll tell you why in a sec. They range from relatively cheap to pretty expensive. I think anywhere in between sort of $200 to like $3,500 for the super beefy ones. There's a whole bunch of different makers that make them. So if you are thinking of getting seriously into digital art, this is absolutely something you're going to need. I use a Wacom Cintiq. You can see I'm just using a stylus and I've got like a pen. You'll see me kind of looking down rather than up at my screen. That's because I'm kind of drawing on that. But the main difference with this is that if I'm drawing with a mouse, I'm only going to get kind of like an on or off switch, right? The mouth is either clicked or not clicked. And so all these options that I can mess around with in this brush, all these settings that exist here that we'll take a look at next week, kind of go away because it's either on or it's off. Whereas a pen has pressure sensitivity built into it, and maybe even tilt angles built into it. So that allows Photoshop to create a whole bunch of different settings for you when you're working. So in this instance, I've set my brush, and this is my normal kind of like painting brush or like sketching brush, if you will. My brush will be, if I'm pressing down lightly, it will create a very thin, low opacity kind of line. And if I start pressing a bit harder, you can see it gradually gets thicker and darker. And so what that's going to do is it's going to allow me to get kind of like a sketching feel as if I was working with pencil. There are actually pencil brushes out there that we can take a look at in another stream. But basically, this is the main reason why you want to be able to kind of take full advantage of your brushes and the options that you have in your brushes in Photoshop. You will need a stylus and a drawing tablet of whatever kind of make that you want. They all work pretty well. But you will need that. The second reason why you will need that is that drawing with a mouse is not very comfortable. It's not very intuitive. I always kind of say it's like doing brain surgery with a brick. It's just, it's no fun. And the result is generally not going to be great as well. So drawing with an actual pen on a surface, it feels very much like natural drawing, and that's what you want, right? Okay, so we have kind of spoken about that. We've got a color window here that we can pick colors. Obviously, we can draw in a range of different colors. We can kind of do all this painting as we need to and swap the colors around. So we'll have that panel open. We have a navigation panel open. So if I zoom in, and this is the first shortcut that we're going to take a look at here. Zooming in, you've got Command or Control and plus or minus on your keyboard. So plus obviously makes your image bigger, minus zooms out. So generally speaking, you'll hear artists talk about how they tend to have one hand kind of obviously on the canvas drawing and then another hand on the keyboard hovering over the command key and then something else. That's usually the way that we kind of like to work, simply because you're going to be using shortcuts all the time. It's not a big deal to have to go up here and then do a thing, but if you're doing that like 50, 60 times in the course of your workflow, it can be quite interrupting and it can take a little bit more time to get there. So using your shortcuts will make your workflow a lot more streamlined and make your whole life a whole lot easier. So yeah, so get used to using them. So plus, we'll zoom in, minus with command will zoom out. And what the navigator does is it will allow me to kind of move around my canvas. It shows me kind of where I am. It's like a map of my canvas, if you will. If I make this bigger, you can kind of see what I'm talking about. It's like a rectangle view of where I'm at. The equivalent of that, if I'm in basically any tool at all, any of the tools that I've got in my toolbar here, and we'll take a look at some of those a little bit later in this stream. Any of those toolbars that I've got, any of those tools, if I hold down the Option key, you'll see my cursor turns from like this big round brush to a little kind of hand. And then if I click and drag, I can move my canvas or my image around on the canvas, and you can see that my navigator window is moving as I'm doing it. So yeah, so you can have the navigator open if you don't necessarily like to do that, or if you like to be really up close, and then kind of doing this is going to take you too much time because you have to hold down the space bar and kind of click and drag a million times. You can just do it a lot more quickly in one single flow with the navigator. So you can have that open. I generally tend not to, but I just wanted to show you guys that that's there available if you want to. And then finally, one of the main kind of features of any digital drawing program is the ability to undo and redo stuff, right? So you made a mistake and you did something that you didn't want to do. Command Z or Control Z will undo those. And as you go through, you can see that it's undoing all of those strokes. There is a limit which you can set, but to how many times you can go back. The more kind of times you allow Photoshop to go back, the more it has to store them in its memory and history, the more it's going to slow your program down. So generally, I'd say probably about sort of like 20 to 30 iterations is probably the way to go. And we'll take a look at how to fix that in a next stream as well. But what I wanted to show you is you can undo and then you can redo with Command Shift Z. Will redo those brushes. So if you pressed it one too many times and you want to kind of go back, you can undo and redo. And what this panel does, the history panel, is it basically shows you literally the history of your workflow, right? So if I go back and just go back up this list, it'll start to kind of undo or redo, and I can kind of jump to a certain stage of my artwork. So I don't have to press Command Z a million times. So the history panel is a nice one to have there as well. Again, I tend not to have this one open, simply because I just do Command Z, Command Shift Z to undo, redo, and that's enough for me to work with. All right. So that's the basic panels that you need. There are, as I said, a ton more in here, but a lot of them tend to, like these two guys, as well as character and character styles, they have to do with like when you're using text and stuff, which you may or may not do. 3D, obviously, actions, all this kind of stuff is not necessarily super relevant to drawing. So we're not going to take a look at those. The main ones that you need, obviously, is brushes to draw with, colors to pick whatever color those brushes are drawing onto, and then a few different kind of quality of life panels like the history panel or the navigator is enough. And then finally, this guy here. So layers is at the heart of pretty much any Adobe program, Photoshop especially. Layers is everything. It's like, if you want to kind of think about it like this, it's like you have a canvas that you're drawing a painting on, and you can come in with another layer on top of that that can have some things, and like think about it like tracing paper, right? So we're going to draw like some ears on that, and so when you kind of look at your drawing, you've got this, and then you got some ears, but these ears can move around separately, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new layer. I'm going to show you guys how that works. So in our panel here, you can see that I've got quite a long panel. You can adjust this as well if you need to. You can kind of resize this as you need. Same with any of these panels, you can kind of resize. And we're going to go down in our little toolbar here, and we can hover, and it's just going to give us a new layer. All right? And it's called layer 1 by default. If I make a second one, we've got layer 2, layer 3, layer 4, blah, blah, blah. All right, and so on. So the more layers you create, the more it's going to name these. It's a good idea. It's good practice. This is not necessarily like a drawing tip. This is just a workflow tip. It's a good idea to name your layers. So you can double click on the text, and then you highlight it, and then you can just type on your keyboard whatever you've got here. So let's say that I've got a drawing here that I'm going to do of, like, I don't know, let's say I'm going to do like a really quick and simple one. I'm going to draw a smiley face, fill that in, nice and quick, all right, really rough. And then I'm going to make a new layer, and I'm going to draw with my color with a black. I'm going to draw eyes and a face and a big smile, all right? So what's cool about this is I can now edit this or hide it or show it independently from the background, right? As opposed to analog painting, where it's like those two things need to be on the same canvas. And if you mess up or you want it to be bigger or smaller, you can't really mess around with it too much. So having layers is a really good way to go. How many layers you make is kind of up to you. Obviously, we can have, you know, a ton of different layers. There's kind of no limit to how many layers you have. And it's a good idea to have a lot in there, or as much as you kind of need. But you can also have too many. So what can you do now with this particular layer? So we're going to get into some of the different tools now that we've got with our drawing here. We can go in and make a selection on this, or we can kind of move this around. So far we've been using the brush tool, which conveniently on your keyboard, by the way, is B. You can see here, like with our options, our panel up here in the windows, we've got a bunch of different letters that's just saying that's B. So B is our brush tool, B for brush, easy to remember. And then the move tool, which is going to allow us to kind of move this around, is this one up here, which is V on your keyboard, right? So move, mostly because M's already taken by something else. But now I can move this around on my canvas. I can place it somewhere else. I can do whatever I want with it because they're on separate layers, right? If I go to my drawing layer, and you go to those by selecting them, so you click on the actual layer itself and you can select that layer, and we can move it around. Little bit of a tip for you as well. Up here, you've got, and I don't know if this is going to work if I zoom in on this, if you guys are going to see this or not. But if you go up here, you've got this option to automatically select physically from your canvas. So rather than having to go up into this panel here, you can actually, if you have this ticked, auto select from layer, I can actually just click on these, and I can just kind of like, basically if there were pieces of paper on my canvas, I can just like touch it and then move it around. It's a little bit more intuitive than doing it the old kind of way, which is like selecting it in here and moving that around. So as I said, we can move it around, but we can also make this smaller or bigger as we need to, right? And how I'm going to do that is I'm going to make sure that I've got the right layer selected. So my face layer, I want to make that a little bit smaller in the kind of the yellow head that I've got here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in with my shortcut and do Command T. And that's going to bring in what's called a bounding box, and these little kind of squares that you see on the corners, which are called handles. And what that does, if I click and drag them, is it allows me to kind of like stretch, squash, edit this, make it bigger, make it smaller, even rotate it. If I just hover on the outside, so if I'm on the handle, I get the one for resizing. If I just go a little bit further out from that, I get this little kind of like bent double arrow. and I can rotate this, right? And it conveniently tells me, if you see this little like highlighter pop up here, it's like -20, -3, blah, 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 all this kind of stuff, right? So I can edit, resize all this. It's all kind of possible because it's on a separate layer. So I can do these things accurately with that. Once you're done with that, you can either hit return, enter, and that applies that, or I can undo it. And let's go ahead and change that again, rotate it. If I'm not happy with it, I can hit escape and it will undo all of that, right? It won't apply that particular transformation that I created. But that is something that you need to remember whenever you've transformed something. I'm not finished. This is still live. I can't really do anything else. Like if I go to my brush tool now, it does apply. Okay, Photoshop's updated that. It used to not do that. It used to be able that, like, it used to mean that if you kind of had a live transformation, it wouldn't let you do anything else until you'd applied that transformation. So they've obviously recently changed that. The next thing I want to show you is, whilst you've got that transformation up, if you hold down Shift, and Shift is going to be something that's going to come back with a lot of different tools. If I hold down Shift, it'll stop me from like distorting this image, and it will make me kind of resize this proportionally. So this is crucial whenever you're working with like portraiture, faces, type, whatever it might be, or if you've got a perfect circle and you want it to stay a perfect circle, you're going to have to hold down Shift while you rescale, and that's going to give you that kind of proportional shift, right? You can also have Shift while you rotate, and that's going to break you at 15-degree increments, right? So if you're trying to like rotate it perfectly at 90 degrees, you could do that manually, or you could just hold down Shift, and it's going to give me like increments of that particular thing, right? Cool. So what if I only want to do part of that particular thing, right? So next tool we're going to look at is, we've got 3 different selection tools at the top here. We've got a marquee tool, which is M, which is why our move tool is not M. That makes a rectangular selection, right? If I hold that down, I can go to a circular selection or an elliptical selection. Again, that's an ellipse. If I hold down Shift, it's going to give me a perfect circle, right? So all these tools have like a shift option where it's like, if you want the thing to be like perfect, you will have to hold down Shift. Same thing applies with this rectangle, right? If I want that to be a perfect square, hold down Shift, it's going to make me a perfect square selection. So what is a selection? Let me go to this one, which is my lasso tool. I've got 3 in here. I'm only going to use this top one for today. This lasso tool allows me to draw a selection around something. Now, what a selection is this little kind of area that you see here, which has got what we call marching ants. They're like a little line of ants like marching. That highlights the particular area, and whatever is inside that area is going to be affected and nothing else, right? So I've selected that eye. I haven't really like landed on anything else in that particular selection. But if I hold down now Command T, you'll see that I'll be able to move and scale that part of my drawing and make my guy like do a little wink, for instance, and I've only affected that thing. So whatever I do now will only affect whatever that selection has applied to. And this is crucial to Photoshop because it allows you to say, I don't want to do a thing to my entire layer. I just want you to do it to this particular section, right? And you'll see how that all applies a little bit later on. If I now go back to my brush, so hit B on my keyboard, and I want to change that to like a different color, but only that, you'll see that my eye goes blue because I got it selected. But if I draw over here, nothing happens because I don't have that included in my selection, right? So there's a range of different selection tools. As I said, we got the marquee tool, which is rectangles, circles, and shapes. We've got the lasso tool, which allows you to draw a particular selection. And then we've got this guy here, which is a magic wand, which allows you to kind of like do special selections, which we won't get into too much right now. But basically what it does is it looks at similar pixels and selects them all automatically for you. And it's just a little bit of a cleaner way to do selections sometimes, but we won't look at that too much. So I'm going to deselect this, Command D for deselect. All right. That just means that I can kind of undo that particular selection. So layers, selections, brushes are the three ways of kind of telling Photoshop, I want to do this thing to this image or this part of the image included in my selection. Right. So you can kind of decide what to do and how to do it. Okay, so let's go ahead and let me delete all those layers. So I've created a layer. If I hit delete with that layer selected, it just deletes the layer and everything on it. So be careful before you do that, that you don't have anything that you want on that layer. Obviously, you can always undo, but yeah, if you've, by the way, saved your file, closed it, reopened it the next day, all of your history is gone. Like as soon as you save that file and close it, it starts from scratch. So you won't be able to undo anything you did yesterday. So just be aware of that. Okay, so what we're going to look at now is we're going to take a look at bringing in images to draw from. So we'll draw in a little bit more kind of base next week. But what I wanted to show you guys today is how to kind of draw from reference and how to bring in different images and manipulate them with your tools to get something that you're going to be kind of happy with. So I've got these kind of images that I've prepared a little bit earlier, and we're going to take maybe something like this and this Torii Gate, and maybe we'll grab this one as well. So we're going to select all three of these and we can open them up in Photoshop. So drag them down onto our icon. If you're on a Mac or a PC, this works both ways. And you can see now at the top here, I've got my canvas and the three images that I have just brought into Photoshop. So what I can do now is I can say, all right, I can either drag the entire image with my move tool. So this move tool here, hit V on your keyboard, and you can literally just drag it up to the tab where your image was, still holding down my pen, by the way, still holding down the mouse or the click that you've got, and then let it go. And it just kind of drags it in there. Right? So a lot of people kind of get this wrong. It's a pretty simple one, but you have to hold that click down the whole way and wait for your image to pop up, wait for that canvas to pop up, and then you can drop it into that particular canvas. Right? Otherwise, what you can do is you can make a selection across the entire thing. So we're going to go ahead and either make a selection using the marquee tool, so rectangular, and we can drag, and that's going to select the whole thing. Or I can do Command A for all, and that's going to select the entire canvas available to me. I'm going to do Command C, which is probably something that you've heard from other, like basically every program ever written for whatever it is uses Command C, Command V, copy and paste. So Command C, and then go to my tab and then hit Command V, and it will do the same thing. So there's always with Photoshop, there's numerous ways of doing the same thing. Whichever one you're most comfortable with is how you should roll on this. Because it's just, yeah, that's your workflow. There's not necessarily a right or wrong way. There's several ways to do it. Whichever one you like best is the one that you should kind of choose. So let's bring in these images. We can close this one now. We don't need it anymore. We can bring in this one as well. So let's move it in and drop it in here. And we can close that one. And let's leave this one open because I actually want to use this one more as a kind of a reference. Right? So in Photoshop, you can actually change the way that this all looks when you're working. Right? So at the moment, I've got a bunch of tabs up here, and if I want to look at this image here, I need to kind of click on the tab, switch back and forth. It's a little bit annoying. If I wanted for a bit of a side-by-side to use that as reference, I'm going to have to do something a little bit different, which is go to my window, arrange, and I'm going to go up vertical, bang. And it just gives me those two images side by side. Obviously, if I had three images, it would put all three side by side. But this now means that I can kind of work to whatever I'm working with and just have that image open on the side. I can shift that over a little bit to bring my canvas back in the center, move this panel over. So I can now use this as reference if I wanted to. If I didn't want it in my image, I can just kind of look back and forth as if I was drawing from real life. Okay. I don't really love that generally when I'm drawing. Again, that's a personal choice, but so I'm going to go back to Window, Arrange, and I'm going to go Consolidate all tabs, and it's going to bring that back in and to what I had before. And now I can bring this guy into here. And you'll notice every time I bring in an image, it puts it on its own new layer that I can move around individually from the other ones. Anytime you bring in something else, it will create that particular thing on a separate layer in that canvas. And now what we need to do is we can go into here. I can hit Command T. I'm going to rescale this, holding down Shift, right? And return, apply that. And now I can do something which is quite cool. If I go up to my options in my layer here, I've got this slider up here that says opacity. I can drop the opacity of this image down to make it kind of like behind a veil, right? Then I'm going to go to my little kind of Tory gate. Alessandra, you're asking if there's going to be more episodes. There will be more, but next week. So next week I'm doing today, episode 1, episode 2, next Thursday, I think, will be one a little bit more about brushes and so on. And then the third and final episode will be about coloring and kind of bringing it all together. So back to this, I want to put this kind of Tory gate up here, but I kind of want it to be in perspective. So I'm going to Command T. I'm going to increase its size a little bit. And now I'm actually going to hit Command or Control on my keyboard. And my mouse kind of changes. And what that does is it allows me to kind of like warp stuff, put it a little bit like it's in perspective. Because I kind of want like a looking up at this Tory gate kind of view. So I can kind of use this as reference, and I can just do this straight up in Photoshop using that to kind of create this view that I'm kind of looking for. And then this guy can just live up here because he's just going to be a little bit of a kind of like a reference point for me to start drawing. So let's go ahead and start drawing straight up into here. So we're going to do this one. We're going to call it drawing, and I'm going to use a brush. So I'm going to use this brush here that has this kind of like lower opacity if I press lightly and a thinner line. Next thing I'm going to do is I want to move these two together. So if you select Shift, you can select multiple layers at the same time. So layer 1 and layer 2 are now selected. If I do Command T, it'll move them both at the same time, recenter my image, go back to my drawing, and I'm going to draw myself a frame in this image. This is more of like a general drawing tip for you, is like trying to stay within the page is always a little bit tricky. So drawing a nice little kind of frame within the canvas just helps you kind of work that a little bit better. And you see me drawing these perfect lines instead of kind of these like wobbly kind of trying to be straight lines. That's because I'm holding down Shift. So Shift and Draw gives you perfectly straight lines to work with. You can also do Shift if you click, hold down Shift and then move and click to another place. You won't see that because it's doing it with my pen, but if you do this, you'll see that it draws perfectly straight lines from one point to the next if you just keep like clicking there. Okay, so we're pretty good with this. I think that I actually want to flip this image here to kind of use as a resource. So with that image selected, Command T, right click on that, and we're going to go down to flip horizontal, and it's going to flip that for us like so. And that's going to be a little bit nicer. Now we can start to kind of draw this very, very loosely. And again, you can see I'm using kind of this as a tracing base, but we're going to create some of our own kind of shapes in a sec as well. So there's not really kind of any trouble with this. I think I sometimes get a little bit kind of scared of like, oh, am I just tracing? Am I still a legit artist? But yeah, there's a lot that we're going to do to this. We're just using this as a kind of a basis to start our image. And having it on that lowered opacity just means that I can kind of see what I'm drawing without having to kind of turn that layer on and off as much as I would if I didn't have it on a lowered opacity. Yeah. So that's looking pretty good so far. Just going to do the rest of this. I might move this guy back down to like here and make him a little bit smaller. Bingo. And then do our kind of staircase up to that. Drop that one, hide that one. So if you click on the little eyeball here, you can hide a layer. And then I'm going to use this one. Let's zoom in a little bit. Use this one as a reference point to get this Torii Gate in perspective, looking how we want it to look. The cool thing with Photoshop as well, if you're kind of trying to draw at a weird angle, sometimes your hand can get a little bit kind of weird. It's not a comfortable angle to draw it. If you hit R on your keyboard, you're going to bring up this little icon and you can actually rotate your canvas. A lot of tablets will let you do this with touch as well. If you just like any kind of iPad or whatever, will let you just kind of do 2 fingers and turn, and you'll get a little bit more of a comfortable angle to work with. So in Photoshop, that just hits on R, and if you hit escape, it'll flip it back to what it was before. So cool. So we've got that happening, and now we can just kind of look at that. I can move this a little bit as well. So I'm going to make a selection around that with my lasso tool. And if I hold down Command, I can reposition this a little bit, and I can rescale this as well. That's looking a bit better. And then we can keep drawing. Command deselect, otherwise I will not be drawing on what it is I'm trying to draw. So yeah, so we'll take a look at drawing in a lot more detail in the next episode that we're going to be doing in next week on Thursday. But essentially, we've just kind of imported a couple of images into this, using them as reference to create kind of our own artwork. And then this guy sits there to kind of give us an inkling of like, all right, we get these big, tall, like trees that are going to happen as part of this as well, that are going to come in and kind of frame this Torii Gate. Anything that I'm doing here is manipulatable as well, right? Because it's all on its own layer. It's all separate from the background. If I've decided that like, oh no, this isn't working, I need to change something else, you just make your selection around it, move it around, transform it, get rid of it. If you hit delete, it'll erase it. Which is the other thing actually that I should probably mention real quick as well, is you can draw with a Wacom pen or like any kind of stylus like this. I use a Wacom. But on the other side, there's an eraser. So if you just flip that over, there's an erasing capability that you can do there. Or if you're not keen on flipping your pen over because that's not how you like to roll, you can hit E for eraser, and then you can just draw with the eraser. Just remember that that's what you've got selected, and don't start kind of drawing with the eraser and erase your entire drawing. You're not going to be too happy about that probably. But yeah, that's kind of like the basics of kind of getting started. And so the main things I wanted to cover today with you guys is how to start your new document. What are the panels that you need to look at, and kind of not get discouraged right out of the door because you're looking at Photoshop for the first time and opening it up and you're just kind of like, whoa, I need to know all of this. No, you don't, right? Photoshop and photography and drawing and type and everything else has its own kind of like set of panels that you can use. You do not need to know all of Photoshop to do any of this stuff, even if you want to be like a super proficient artist working in kind of video games or movies or whatever. You won't need to know all of the options and panels and menus and tools that are available in Photoshop. That would just be absolutely crazy. All right, and then we'll finish this up before we end this stream by just showing you again, kind of like using my selection tool to create a little bit of kind of shading, but in specific areas, right? Let me put a little kind of like lantern here as well. Bring some shading into there. So I want to kind of shade the tops of these trees a little bit and kind of give them a little bit of extra light. So what I can do is I can go to my lasso tool, make a selection, pretty rough one. Again, we're just kind of sketching here. We're not doing anything super clean. And if I hold down Shift, you'll see a little plus that comes up on my selection tool. And that means that I can make another or add to that selection in another spot. Right? And I can do that as much as I want in as many places as I want. As long as I'm holding down Shift, it'll keep adding shapes to that particular selection. And now what I can do is I can make my brush a little bit bigger. So next shortcut for you guys is the brackets, right? So open and close bracket. Open bracket makes your brush smaller, close bracket makes your brush bigger, which you can control. As you guys can see as I'm doing this, it's over here. You can control it in this panel, but easy to control it with the shortcuts. And now I can draw, but you'll see that it will only draw in the areas that I've selected. So I can do these big, long kind of like strokes and not be worried about it going somewhere else in the drawing that I don't want it to kind of go into. And I can get a kind of like a little bit of a very quick and rough kind of gradient effect on these particular areas because I've got them selected separately from the background. So again, this is a really kind of handy way for you to be able to kind of draw like this and trying to get, you know, a little bit of this kind of lighting impact and effect without having to worry about being too clean about it. So that's basically it for today's tips, right? So we've covered a few different things. The main things, as I said, is obviously using your brushes, use your layers, use them wisely. They're there for you to help you, so make use of them. Selection tools, transform tools, trying to edit the shapes and things that you have created. And then, yeah, just having a little bit of fun and like drawing from reference. So next week on Thursday, we're going to look at kind of drawing from scratch, and that's going to get a little more in depth. We're going to look at creating your own brushes. It's going to be a little bit more kind of intense in terms of like pure drawing. But what I wanted to cover today is kind of like housekeeping. This is your new home of drawing. Where are all the things, where are all the switches and bells and whistles, what do they all kind of do, and kind of take that as we go along. So thanks for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys learned something from this. Thanks for the questions. Thanks for tuning in, and I will hope to see you guys next week. Thanks for watching.